Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, I'm going to be acting as your slightly brooding, ever skeptical academic guide through what is essentially a grimdark Gothic fable. It's this wild, very literal translation of high philosophy into magic. We're unpacking the Sapphire Forge Dialectics of the Crimson Ascent. And honestly, we're going to see exactly what happens when cold mathematical perfection tries to completely erase the messy, chaotic reality of the human soul.
We have to start our journey by examining this terrifying core concept, Siler. It's the Latin root for taking a permanent rest from the kinetic friction of existence. And this forms the absolute bedrock of what the text calls zero-point utilitarianism. See, in the early days of this universe, the loud, weeping, messy existence of a soul, it's not treated as something sacred. No way. It's treated merely as an equation that needs to be solved and erased. It's a hardcore philological commitment to total, undisturbed silence, literally stripping away everything that makes us human, just to achieve this cold, calculated peace. Age 1, the Sapphire Matrix. Age 2, the Verdant Corruption. Age 3, the Crimson Ascent. And finally, Age 4, the Great Evening. What we're actually tracking here is the Fichtean dialectic mapped across 4 distinct epochs. It's the chronological evolution of a soul, stretched out across massive eras of suffering and synthesis. It is a structural roadmap of how identity violently rebels against being erased. To really grasp this rebellion, we need to contrast two foundational forces in this Fichtean model. On one side, we have the absolute I, which is represented as living ink. Think of this as the weeping, resilient human self, which the text calls the strongest cage ever built. Then, on the other side, we have the absolute not I, the lunar spirit of clinical unmaking. That's the oppressive force of the forge, desperately trying to permanently freeze that vibrant living self into a static silicate artifact. It's the ultimate showdown, right? Raw, messy existence for sterile, forced perfection. And that brings us to the architect of all this sterile perfection, the Jester of Sapphire Light. In his initial state, acting as the necessary fire, he practices this total aesthetic detachment. I mean, he looks at all our concentrated human sorrow, our joy, the entire friction of life, and he just views it as, quote, thermodynamic noise. It's incredibly bleak. To him, this noise just has to be silenced and solved into industrial data to keep the ultimate mass energy balance in this forced utopia. Achieving this level of industrial finality requires a deeply disturbing process called kenosis. Now, this isn't just physical death. It's a dark, voluntary hollowing out of the self. The forge literally mathematically unmakes souls. It strips away their identity, their history, their pain, and turns them into these perfectly silent blue stars. It's the absolute not I completely taking over, emptying out what makes a person, all for the sake of the absolute stillness required by the ledger. But well, as any skeptical academic will tell you, perfect arithmetic always breaks down when you apply it to the human spirit. And that introduces us to kaios, the Greek concept of a gaping maw. When you surgically extract all the vitality and sorrow from a soul, it doesn't just go quietly. It leaves behind this terrifying void. It's the absolute horror of an identity that stubbornly refuses to be erased. This unassimilated voltage of the human spirit finally starts to push back against the forge's mathematical perfection. This failure totally fractures the aesthetic of the universe, plunging us into the verdant corruption. The pure, clinical blue radiance of the sapphire matrix breaks down, bleeding into the sickly, pulsing emerald. The jester himself stops being a perfect agent of stillness and instead morphs into a corrupted sanctuary. He's now forced to physically house the very unassimilated voltage and weeping chaos he had just been trying to mathematically erase. Completely overwhelmed by the failure of his grand arithmetic, the jester passes through a liminal gateway known as the uncanny forest. The story hits this heavy state of pure narrative inertia here. The clinical stillness is totally gone, replaced by, quote, chaos and ink. He runs into the spirit siblings, finally confronting the messy reality of the absolute I that he literally cannot ignore anymore. His perfect aesthetic detachment has completely failed, leaving him just wandering through his own discarded shadows. So let's move into the Crimson Ascent and see how this escalates. This is where we shift from passive decay to active, violent transformation. Heralded by the arrival of the Crimson Dragon, that sickly green corruption gets burned away by a stark, sudden moral weight.
The jester's clinical detachment is just ripped away from him, forcing an unavoidable confrontation with real suffering. The era of cold mathematics is officially over. We are now in the era of blood and heat. The actual mechanics of this transformation are brutal. First, the jester enters the Red Room, which is this stark beacon of heat. Then, the Crimson Doctor grafts the rune of Inferno right onto him. And this triggers a massive philosophical shift. He transitions from being this catalyst of stillness trying to silence the universe into becoming a literal furnace of fiery, active suffering himself. He has to accept this agony of the blazing abyss. That old, detached arithmetic of the Overman is completely unraveled, burned away by the litmus of honest truth. He can't pretend pain is just an equation anymore. By taking the fire into himself, the unassimilated voltage of his own identity bursts outward. For the first time, he actually feels the heavy, agonizing weight of existence, rather than just calculating it from a distance. This fiery agony brings us to the Mead Hall of Giants, the Violet Realm. Here, the jester takes the chaos of that emerald corruption, combines it with the fiery pain of the Crimson Ascent, and claims a new tragic divinity. It's a huge realization. Personified by the Knight of Inkblot, it proves that true identity isn't found in perfect silence. Actually, scratch that. It's more like identity has to be actively rebuilt from the very shadows, the ink, and the suffering that the Forge originally tried to throw away. And this brings us to the culminating event, the apotheosis of Sapphire living ink. Triggered by a literal broken sapphire gem, which is such a great symbol for the shattering of that old cold perfection, we get this ultimate alchemical synthesis. The Fichtean dialectic finally resolves itself. The clinical void of the absolute not I is painfully, beautifully reconciled with the persistent, weeping human self of the absolute I. The jester becomes a finished monument, a living embodiment of both stillness and sorrow. You really have to notice the stark contrast between the start and the end of this fable. We began with an enforced industrial finality. That forced utopia achieved through mathematical erasure and silencing souls. But now, we've arrived at a terminal stillness. And this new stillness isn't born from some cold calculation. It's born of utter narrative completion. The story hasn't been erased. It has simply been fully, exhaustively told until there's just nothing left to say. So, the universe finally arrives at the great evening. This is the terminal state of existence. Picture a starless void in the sky, illuminated only by the star of high time, the mimic sun hanging over the Inquisitor Tower. Narrative inertia has reached its absolute terminal point. The ultimate mass-energy balance is finally achieved. But again, not by solving an equation. It's achieved through the sheer, tragic exhaustion of the universe's narrative arc. We find ourselves in the final landscape, the realm of frozen reality, a world of jagged ice. And here, the jester wields the terrifying negation gaze. This is a highly evolved, proactive spirit that demands all stories, all existence, be perfectly finished and frozen. He literally holds the power to look upon the remnants of the universe and plunge them into permanent, unbreakable silence. The final, cold victory of the Forge seems basically guaranteed. Yet, as a brooding observer of this whole macabre history, I have to ask, why? Why, at the very end of all things, after achieving this ultimate power, does the jester willfully choose to dampen his vision? He deliberately restrains the negation gaze. He performs this final act of will to save his companion, the last thinker, from being perfectly finished by the ice. Why spare him? Well, he does it to preserve the Fichtean dialogue. By sparing the last thinker, he deliberately preserves a tiny spark of that original thermodynamic noise. He proves that even at the cold, frozen end of existence, even when the world is perfectly finished, the weeping noise of identity remains fundamentally necessary. Because without that slight friction, without the absolute I constantly pushing back against the absolute not I, the silence isn't peace, it's just nothingness. Which leaves us with a final, chilling thought to ponder. If even the architect of negation, the master of the Sapphire Forge himself, eventually realized he had to spare the thermodynamic noise of a soul, are you too eager to silence your own messy, fiery existence? Would you truly trade the chaotic, painful, kinetic friction of your life for a cold, mathematical, forced utopia? It's definitely a question worth brooding over long after this explainer ends.